next speaker is Inge Goudsmit. The title of her lecture is Urban Politics in Making Places. She is assistant professor at the School of Architecture of the Chinese University of Hong Kong. She's teaching and conducting research in architecture and urban design with a focus on urban politics. Inge is an architect and an urban designer with 17 years of experience in practice. And before joining the university, she was an associate at the Office for Metropolitan Architecture, where she designed and expedited prestigious urban projects across multiple scales in all development phases in Asia and Europe. So quite a practitioner before she came to join us as an academic, right? Among them, she mentions, among them is the Taipei Performing Arts Center, which is due for completion this year, it looks like. Her research interests are situated at the boundary between architecture and social sciences and focus on the influence of the transnational and local forces on the production and appropriation of architecture. Inge, I'm really looking forward to your talk. Please, I'll wave hands again as you get near the end. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Zeta, for this introduction. Thanks also, Francesco and the team to have me today. I'm very excited to be among this panel. And indeed, great start already. So I'm not sure if I can follow up in the same quality, but I'll do my best. So let me share my screen.
Looks good. Looks really good.
Yeah.
Everybody else? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So I called my my talk "Urban Politics in Making Places" to connect kind of two different things. It was a last-minute change, so I kind of looked at what I had, and I wanted to basically talk about my two-sided personality, if you will. First of all, at the moment, I'm an assistant professor at CUHK, but I'm also a practitioner and architect for 15 or 17 years or so. Indeed, mostly at OMA, but also a few other offices. And only since last summer, about 1 year ago, I moved into academia. And my contribution today will cover these both perspectives, both the academic perspective and the practicing architect, which are quite different and quite contradictory, but I think both important because they both add very much to this debate, I hope. So first of all, practice. Today I will show a project from my experience at OMA in the Greater Bay area. To discuss the kind of reality of how places are being made these days, at least in many occasions, as has been pointed out also by Mio Drag and Francesco before. A lot of top-down projects conceived by planners, architects, clients, of course, with a focus on spectacular images. And in this discussion, I will focus mostly on the kind of urban politics within this design process. I worked on quite a few big projects at OMA. I led master plans and architecture. One of them indeed is one of my babies, the Taipei Performing Arts Center, which is due to complete, and I'm actually still working on that project. So I'm sort of mixing two worlds because this project also is the focus of my PhD research at least as a case study. And then the other side of me, which is kind of my move to academia, where I try to look at these processes that I know from one side very intensely. I want to look at them in more detail. So it's a critique on practice and the neoliberal environment that we operate in. And over the past 15 years or so, I've seen the increase of these economic forces as project schedules get shorter, deliverables exploded. Clients are much more kind of intense about what we need to produce. There's less time to think, and there's more requirements for spectacular images, if you will. And this, of course, aligns with the observations of scholars like Harvey, Zukin, and Sclair that already since the 1990s consider architecture as urban spectacles that are driven by the rich and powerful. Interestingly, and I know this from experience, architects don't see themselves like this. or at least their position is very ambiguous. The leaders of companies might know this game, but most architects, including the ones that we educate here in school, don't kind of consider themselves as players in this larger neopolitical, neoliberal game. And I don't know how many people within this audience are actually architects, but I think most of architects consider themselves as sort of fighting for public space, negotiating with the client to make a project a little bit better, create public spaces or common spaces if it's a completely non-public project. Whereas from the outside, architects are often seen, of course, of wanting to put their own signature, potentially at the cost of the urban living environment. So that's an interesting contrast. And again, I'm sort of in the middle of these two positions. So my research focuses on an analysis of the different spatial imaginaries that are used to show and to understand urban design. And this sort of fits loosely within the framework of Henri Lefebvre on the production of space, where of course he analyzed the conceived space by politicians, planners, and architects, and counterposes this with the perceived and the lived spaces of the city. And I think that is very much the topic also of today. So I'll show one project and explain a little bit about it, and then I'll give some thoughts or some conclusions.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Sorry,
we weren't sure if the circle did not have any text in it, but let's move on. Let's move on. We're fine.
Okay. Yeah, it's an abstract circle. Thank you. So the project that I will talk briefly about is the Tencent campus in the master plan in Shenzhen. It's a project in the Greater Bay Area, of course. And as you all know, Tencent is one of the largest tech companies in China. It's mostly known for gaming and WeChat, but it's a very large imperium, in fact. And this project was a project for 2.6 million square meter of GFA, which is enormous. It's a scale that Europeans cannot really imagine, in fact. It's it's designed for 80,000 employees and 20,000 residents. So this is literally the size of a European city, right? It's the size of the European city that I come from. And I thought it was interesting to show this project as a reference, since, again, a lot of developments are run like this. This project was a competition with 12 so-called star architects. OMA was one of them. Many others you can find on internet. We didn't win, by the way, this project. But nevertheless, I treat it like a case study for myself as a sort of very visionary and very opportunistic planning. The location is in Qianhai. I'm sure you all know Qianhai is the sort of new frontier of Shenzhen. And by looking at the map of Shenzhen, you can sort of see how Shenzhen grew together with Tencent. So Tencent started in the kind of production houses in the old center, if there's a center of Shenzhen. And then it moved to the technology parks in Nanshan. And now it's kind of moving into this new frontier of Qianhai, which is a national tier project, meaning that the national government supervises this project and it thus has a lot of representational value. This is the growth, a diagram of the growth of the company, which in 20 years grew to be one of the largest companies in the world through, extremely smart kind of cultural understanding and a sort of translation of these local cultures into technology. And if you look at this diagram, you see that China's GDP is very closely correlated to the company's growth. The scale of, you see there's a few very tiny dots. Those are actually the floor plans to scale of the different headquarters over time. So it started with Nanshan with 4,000 employees, then 12,000 employees a few years later. Again, a few years later, a project in Beijing for 10,000 employees, which is really quite large. And then this kind of campus, which again, to scale is even for Tencent's growth is kind of unheard of and enormous, right? The location of the project in Qianhai is on the peninsula, which is sort of the last project that still needs to be developed. The rest of the Bay Area has mostly been designed, although of course now they're talking about architectural projects mostly, but the urban scale has been designed. And we thought that this project is on this peninsula is a very prominent and very visible spot. So we thought of it as somewhat like a theater stage, with of course Tencent as the performers. So we called this project the Broadband City, you know, where everybody is watching, if you will. So the government is planning on this, around this circle, they're planning a lot of public parks and amenities around the bay. And we propose to continue this kind of circle of public space. Of course, the definition of public and private space is very contradictory here. The entire campus is officially publicly accessible. It's part of the public street network, etc. It's not going to be a gated community. But at the same time, it's a huge private development that will be managed by Tencent, and is of course not really part of the city, because there's, you know, there are all the amenities that you need for a city, but they won't be used probably as such, because we don't expect a lot of children, for example, to live on this campus. We propose to concentrate the relatively small allowance of public program within the circle on that green spot that you see. To ensure enough density of this public space, but of course also to allow for easier private management of the client. This was a request of the client to do it like this. The program is, again, it's massive, 2.6 million square meters, with about 1.6 million square meter of R&D offices, which we concentrate mostly towards the back in higher towers of this strip on the peninsula. There's currently still a kind of container park behind it. And then the yellow is the residential project, or the residential organization closer towards the waterfront, which, by the way, was not so much liked by the client, because they thought that maybe the focus should be more on the company close to the waterfront rather than the residents, because they're less important. This kind of organization also organizes public space, and of course it gives this kind of section where there's a bit of a view for everybody, but of course it also creates a skyline, which again is a very spectacular skyline, and meant to be that. We try to organize neighborhoods because of the organization of this kind of combination of offices in the back and residential in the front, and amenities and public space, if you will, in the middle. We try to make sure that you wouldn't have a sort of a day village and a night village, or literally a dormitory town, and also try to incorporate as much as possible different types of public space, so that, to make this space, of course, more pleasant. And that, you know, Tencent cares very much for their employees, or at least they say that they do. Then there's a kind of overall organization of different nodes that create some amenities and give each neighborhood a theme. But politically, the most interesting part of this project is actually the tip of the peninsula. Within that circle, we noticed through our project a difference in the power balance between Tencent and the government, which was very interesting. In our initial conversations, Tencent asked us to include a conference center for the government as part of the brief, but the location was determined as a less prominent position than the company's headquarters. So they wanted their own headquarters to be higher and kind of in a better spot. But during the project, the power balance actually changed. And that's visible in this diagram. The company took a major hit on its stocks between the project start and the project finish, mostly due to issues with the company's core gaming business that was related to a regulatory crackdown, in which the central government restricted gaming over officially a concern of nearsightedness. Some people had other thoughts about this, but we will never know. And this was translated immediately into architecture. So the best location on the site, which is the tip of the peninsula, was then to be given to the government building. And this kind of government public space if you will. So this is the kind of final proposal with, that slanted project as a government building. The higher hashtag building, let's say, is the headquarters, and then a skyline of other projects. So this is quite literally a landscape of social and economic power, in Sharon Zukin's words. So this is the kind of spectacular image that we have created, very much according to the top-down proposal. And at the same time, this is not the end. So here I get close to my conclusion of this kind of combination that I try to find between practice and research, and that plus, what happens to that plus, where does it sit? What could I, with my experience, add to academia somehow? So you could say that the practice side of me was concerned with the image making, while the research side, my research side, is concerned with politics. The environment in which architects work is an entrepreneurial one, in which political and capital power is often consolidated. Clients are extremely powerful as they determine the program and the conditions of our sites, but also pay our bills, forcing designers into what Dovey called the silent complicity of architecture. And of course, architecture has always served the interest of those who commission it. Cities and companies compete with urban branding images as they aspire to become visible on the global map. Iconic architectural and urban projects are promoted to boost the metropolitan image and the political career of bureaucrats. While a lot of Asian cities now have their own urban spectacles, this drift also renders the effort somewhat ephemeral as the created landscapes become paradoxically more similar. The image that we see is a frozen perspective of a power struggle between political and economic power. This has an immediate effect on the placemaking and will imminently lead to more private spaces or privatized public spaces. Therefore, I argue that we need to create an understanding of these different competing forces and their context. Architects need to be aware. We need to educate for this, in my opinion. And in my research, I look at the conceived spaces by architects, planners, and corporations, and what these images, or imaginaries, as I call them, symbolize, and to whom. And what do they try to portray? What do they try to sell? As you know, with this kind of new skyline of Tencent, for example. But I also try to counterpose them with the actual lived environment and the energies experienced in the city. The abstract conceived spaces will eventually lead to the creation of lived experiences, and as such be projected onto people's lives. Or if we follow Michel de Certeau, we can distinguish between place and space, the former referring to the fabric of the city created by planners, corporations, and architects, and the latter would be a practice place experienced through everyday life. The interpretation of Constant Nieuwenhuis on this image of the ideal city, in response to that of Le Corbusier of the design city, allows us to understand this different meaning. What we experience is not so much the image conceived by the architect, but the one reproduced by its users through appropriation and use. As Miodrag also pointed out, the moments of resistance to the top-down design. So as an architect and scholar, I hope to contribute to the understanding of this middle ground. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So thank you so much, Inge. Thank you for that. We're really moved in another direction. So let's turn to our